Sure, why not?
Okay, so I am Allie Nabours of SOWELA Technical Community College. I'm chairing this panel, the honor of chairing this panel. And so I'm just going to introduce our speakers and commentators. And other than that, I'm going to moderate time. I will also relay questions from the chat. So if anybody has questions, please enter them in the chat box. And yeah, it's going to be a great panel. So first, we have Tyler Parry, who's an assistant professor of African American and African diaspora studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His first book is Jumping the Broom, The Surprising Multicultural Origins of a Black Wedding Ritual. Along with Robert Green of Claflin University, Dr. Parry co-edited the 2021 volume Invisible No More, The African American Experience at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Parry is currently working on a manuscript with Chaz Yingling on the use of dogs in policing Black populations in slavery and freedom. Today, Dr. Parry will discuss a motley crowd of youngsters, Black radicalism, Reconstruction, and the expansion of public higher education in South Carolina. Shari Rabin is an assistant professor of Jewish studies and religion at Oberlin College. Her first book, Jews on the Frontier, Religion and Mobility in 19th Century America, won the National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies and was a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. Dr. Rabin currently studies the history of Jews, religion, and race in the United States South from the 17th century to the present day. Adam Domby is an associate professor of history at Auburn University. Dr. Domby is the author of The False Cause, Fraud, Fabrication, and White Supremacy in Confederate Memory. He co-edited the volume Freedoms Gained and Lost, Reconstruction and Its Meanings 150 Years Later, which features an essay by Bruce Baker, and it comes out in December from Fordham University Press. Dr. Domby has also written about prisoners of war, guerrilla warfare, Reconstruction, divided communities, and public history. Drs. Rabin and Domby are presenting Rabbi or Con Man, Narrating Religion and Politics in the Era of Reconstruction. Bruce Baker is a reader in American history at Newcastle University. Dr. Baker specializes in working class history and culture in the United States South. Excuse me. His most recent book, co-authored with Barbara Hahn of Texas Tech University, is The Cotton Kings, Capitalism and Corruption in the Turn of the Century New York and New Orleans. Today, Dr. Baker is presenting what's titled to be my next band name, Elephant Johnny and the Crimps, the economic and political control of labor on the New Orleans waterfront, 1865 to 1874. Our commentators today are Elaine Frantz, professor of history at Kent State University, and William Horne, an Arthur J. Ennis postdoctoral fellow at Villanova University, and the co-founder and editor of the Activist History Review. So we're just going to kick it off with Parry now, Tyler Parry. So go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nabours. I appreciate the introduction and honored to be on this panel. I always make it pretty clear to most people that I consider myself a guest in Reconstruction history, and I'm always honored when people enjoy my work and engage with it. This was a project that I discovered more or less in graduate school as I was part of a committee that looked at the desegregation of the University of South Carolina, first in 1963, but interestingly enough, the first desegregation of the university occurred during Reconstruction in 1873 and lasted until 1877. So it was a pretty short window, but Reconstruction scholars know why that was. But I felt like there wasn't enough known about it. There wasn't enough publicity about this moment. And I just became very interested in who the students were and what they did after the closure of the university. And so this paper became a chapter in the volume that Ali had mentioned. And what I'm really looking for the commentators in the audience is, what do you think is missing from the presentation today as constructed? And if it becomes perhaps a larger book-length project, what would someone want to see more in more detail as far as description is concerned? So with that context, the paper begins with a vignette that occurred in 1911 in Columbia, South Carolina. And without the context of understanding the desegregation of the university during Reconstruction, it wouldn't make a lot of sense as to what was going on. Because the group of men who came to Columbia, South Carolina, were all men of African descent, at least as far as I can tell. And they were called the Class of 1879. And the reason why the newspaper that reported upon it called them that is because that is the year they would have graduated from what was called the Radical University at the time. But because of the closure in 1877, when the Jim Crow government, or the so-called Redeemers, came to power, the university was closed to Black students. So they come to Columbia in 1911 as a way to advocate for community leadership, to talk about uplifting the race, to talk about the fight for civil rights effectively. And the thing they all have in common is that they all attended the University of South Carolina together in the 1870s. And their collective occupations were politicians, diplomats, ministers, bishops. They all occupied very important and prominent positions within the Black community at large. And their presence there perhaps served an additional purpose of reminding South Carolinians, both white and Black, that there were students at its flagship institution in the 1870s, and they refused to allow people to forget that, because the Jim Crow historians by this point had effectively dismissed the Reconstruction project as something that had failed and was not worth any attention. It was something that they believed degraded the university. So the alumni, broadly conceived, the class of 1879 during this meeting, was a reminder that that was not true. And you could look at their resumes as evidence of the accomplishments that they had obtained after they left the university. The paper switches over to really when the whole narrative, or the whole story, begins in 1868 with the Constitutional Convention in South Carolina. And I think for Reconstruction scholars, this is a relatively well-known convention for its uniqueness as, I think, the only Black majority delegation in the South at the time. And so what we have here is a group of white and Black delegates who are trying to revise the state constitution, which will pass during the same year in 1868. And there's a variety of what we might call progressive policies that are put in place. But the one thing that I concentrated upon and has direct relevance for this particular paper and project is essentially the establishment of a public school system that was free and open to all, with an emphasis upon the latter version being all, as literally, regardless of race or color or class. And that was built into the language of the 1868 state constitution. So, but what I found interesting is that when I access the actual document, I mean, I think it's something along the lines of 800 to 900 pages, and it goes through a number of different elements of revising the state constitution. But the debates surrounding education were actually very interesting, because the University of South Carolina is not mentioned specifically. Most of the debates are surrounding public education from what we might now call K through 12 education, so school children. And there are some outliers in many ways who believe that, or try to make the case that that public schooling that is free and open to all would institute integration between white and Black students. And so white delegates, I think many of them who are from the upstate portions of South Carolina, are essentially making the claim that this won't work because Black and white children will fight each other if they're in the same space. Now, the Black delegates, many of them descended from free people of color, or many of them freeborn, essentially found it strange that the white delegates chose this hill to die on, essentially. And there's a number of really interesting exchanges between the two groups, to where they say that it's interesting that they are focusing upon that because all we are claiming to do is open up the public schools. Now, if it happens that white and Black children attend school together, that's fine, but nobody's compelling anybody to do anything. And so with a very clear majority, essentially the public school passes. And what that does is it paves the way for integration. It's not entirely clear to me how many K through 12 public schools are actually integrated, but what it does do is it has direct impact upon opening the university up to that possibility. Now, what's kind of strange, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly why it occurred this way, but between 1868, when the university is theoretically open to anybody who wants to apply, it takes about 5 years or so to 1873 before any Black students actually attend. And I'll get to who actually desegregates the university in a moment, but it still remains a focal point for the pro-segregationist press. So the white press is essentially talking about how low the enrollment is for the University of South Carolina, and instead of blaming the white applicants or the white students who didn't apply for the problem with low enrollment, they blame the Black population for the possibility that they might enroll. And so I garnered a number of newspaper articles that explain this as to how, even though the Black population had not yet applied for the university, they were still being blamed for the assumed degradation of the university. But in 1873, Henry E. Hayne, who was freeborn in Charleston, he applies to the university's newly formulated medical school in October of 1873. And there is, by this point, a multiracial board of trustees that is actually ready to admit Black applicants. That is something that had been restructured, I think, by 1869 at this point. So when he applies, the board of trustees resoundingly accepts his application, and they had noted that his accomplishments up to that point suggested he was as well deserving as anybody else to attend. Now, the faculty at this point were still, in many ways, at least the majority, were Confederate sympathizers. And so you actually have a number of resignations. Some of the white students destroy property on their way out. And there's this prophecy that this is the beginning of the end for the university, because there was an assumption that Black students wouldn't apply in large enough numbers to sustain the university. But the Constitutional Convention and the Board of Trustees had actually increased a significant amount of public funding for the university in order to keep it afloat. And so one thing that the white press was unwilling to admit was that the Black delegation, or the multiracial delegation, had essentially ensured that this university was going to be viable and that there needed to be time to build it up. And so Hayne represents kind of this catalyst for the introduction of Black students. And if he felt alone in that moment, it didn't last for very long. At least by 1875, white and Black students' numbers matched each other. It was about 50-50. And by 1876, it was a clear Black majority. So Black students had applied in large numbers and had been admitted. And so then the question came to my mind is, who were these students? What type of biographies could I sketch out about them? How could I find more information about them? And so I started, because one of the things to also note is that at this point, particularly during the early years, most of the students of African descent were born free. They were freeborn individuals from free people of color, free families throughout South Carolina, but also elsewhere as well. But there was a rising number of formerly enslaved students that started to matriculate into the university, and being aware that some of the formerly enslaved students would need more time before they were able to get a formal or sit in like a formal class in higher education, because also the curriculum was kind of based upon a classical curriculum. You had to take classes in Latin. Oftentimes speeches were given in Latin. And so a number of formerly enslaved people were not familiar with this curriculum going in. So what they did is they established a couple of different frames. One was something called the Preparatory Department, which essentially allowed you to be admitted into the university, but you were taking what you might call remedial level classes. So classes that would train you up to the point to where you could take the typical curriculum within the university. And so that was established to help many of the formerly enslaved to prepare themselves for eventual matriculation into college level classes. There's a range as to how long that lasted. Some say it could last up to 4 years, but again, the university didn't have enough time to exist before we could really tell what fruit it would bear. But then there was the sub-freshman class, which is essentially one level below the first years, and that was to ensure individuals who didn't have a framework for higher education would could be prepared to go into what would be called a freshman curriculum at the time. The other thing to note is that the Board of Trustees was also very aware of affordability of higher education. This is, I think, where the Reconstruction policies of South Carolina speak to some of the modern circumstances that we're still debating about public funding of educational systems, because what they did is, realizing that a number of people that would apply to the university just either didn't have the time or the resources to attend, they made the university tuition free. And they offered effectively what we would call stipends, or some form of scholarship, to where you could take a test. And if you scored well on that test, I think there were 3 from each county in South Carolina that were allowed to compete for them. They could also not only go to school for free, but they could receive $20 a month. And this brings me to one of the most interesting figures, I think, within this chapter, is an individual named William Henry Hurd. Because he actually writes a pretty long memoir of himself, because he accomplished a significant amount throughout his life. But the part on South Carolina is actually very small. He contributes about much, but one thing he does note is, he says, as a person who was formerly enslaved in Georgia, gained freedom as a teenager, he talks about his trajectory toward education. So one of the interesting things about him is, when he starts sharecropping throughout the U.S. South, a stipulation he seems to put into his contract, I'm not entirely sure how he did this, but it seems to have worked for him, is he says, I will work for you for a certain amount of money per month, but you also have to promise me that you will give me a recitation every night. So you teach me a letter, you teach me a word, you teach me a number, and over time he's accumulating literacy and knowledge that will prepare him to matriculate into the University of South Carolina in 1873. And he even becomes an educator for a little while when he moves to South Carolina prior to his matriculation. And so, but William Henry Hurd also notes that this scholarship and the tuition-free option was crucial for his development, because he couldn't afford to leave his family behind without some type of monetary support. But because of the scholarships that were offered at the University of South Carolina, he said that he could sustain both himself while he lived in Columbia and send money back to his family. So they weren't actually out of the monetary necessities of the time. And so what I'm trying to uncover now are how many stories mirror William Henry Hurd's story. Like, how much can I find as far as how other formerly enslaved people thought about this particular process and what they were able to accomplish as well. Now, for the sake of time, I'll kind of continue moving through, and happy to answer any questions. But the other thing that's interesting about the campus at this time is that women were not allowed to formally enter into the university curriculum, but women were present on the campus through the state normal school. So the state normal school was established at the University of South Carolina under an individual named Mortimer Warren, who had this pedagogical vision that linked it to the university curriculum. So he believed in like a rigorous form of education. He believed that everybody was capable of accessing knowledge on the same terms. And so what he does is he effectively makes a link between the normal school's curriculum with the university. So the Black women, predominantly, who are at the state normal school at this time, are listening to lectures from university professors at that moment. And in their biographies, one of the things that becomes very clear is both they themselves and others who knew them considered themselves kind of honorary graduates of the university because of the rigors of the actual curriculum that they had through the state normal school. And in some ways, they were sitting next to the other students and listening to the same lectures and acquiring the same knowledge. So I included them within this because their presence on the university grounds was very important for this broader vision of education within South Carolina as kind of the nucleus occurring on the university. One of the individuals that I focus on that I kind of yield to an expert named Alexandria Russell, who recently published an article in the Journal of African American History about this individual, but her name was Celia Dial Saxon. And Saxon is, she's become a piece of modern news in South Carolina because there are some movements student activists who are seeking to place her on the university grounds in some commemorative way. So there's talks of renaming what is the Strom Thurmond Gym or Recreation Fitness Center after her, because it's built upon the school that I believe had her name on it. So there was a Celia Dial Saxon school in South Carolina, and I believe that the current recreation facility sits upon the grounds it used to be. So there are some calls to remove Strom Thurmond and place Celia Dial Saxon on it. And this is well deserved on her part, because thousands of people attended her funeral when she died in the early 20th century, because it was recognized that she had taught thousands of students and made a significant impact within the Columbia area. And so she was beloved by both her community, but also even university faculty. I think one faculty member named Josiah Morse actually spoke at her funeral when she died, because she had this kind of tenacious need to educate particularly Black students throughout South Carolina more broadly. And so she's one of those individuals that I focus on, looking at her accolades and how the university curriculum and the state normal school influenced her pedagogy and her reference point for education. And then the next section I focus on are the white students and this question of allyship. What were the white students doing at the university? Can we get a sense of relationships between the Black and the white students? Predominantly because there was this claim both before and after the Reconstruction project that it wouldn't work because white and Black students simply couldn't get along with one another if they were in the same space. But the Radical University actually disproved this. As far as I can tell, there aren't any reports of problems between the two. There aren't any notations from anyone who attended the university that there were ever any issues. And in fact, they had great love and affection for one another. One of those individuals who was an alum, a white student named Edgar Capelas, he goes on to advocate for people of color throughout his entire career. Thank you. And he is spoken fondly of by his counterparts who also attended the university, both Black and white. And then the white faculty also advocate for the students, one being Fisk Brewer, who was kicked out of the University of North Carolina for causing trouble when talking about integration. So he comes to the University of South Carolina with this understanding that he really wanted to push the project of Reconstruction forward. He wanted to see Black students come to the universities in higher education throughout the South. And then the other is Henry J. Fox, who writes this really interesting article that is essentially responding to the critics or white critics from the Methodist Church who are trying to claim intellectual inferiority from a genetic perspective. And so he argues against this, and he actually says, speaking as an instructor at the University of South Carolina, the first graduate who will graduate with honors was a man of African descent. And so he was using anecdotes and personal experience as a method to combat the assumptions of racial superiority or inferiority during that moment in the 1870s when people were trying to criticize Reconstruction. And so this leads me into the conclusion of the paper, where there is this question, okay, the university closes in 1877, but what do the students end up doing? Where do they go, and how do they feel about the institution after it's closed? And I found a couple of things that are worth mentioning, and then I'll close. One of the things that I found most interesting is that nearly every student, particularly those that there's a record of who accomplished something significant in their lives, the reports about them always listed them as alumni of the University of South Carolina. It was always mentioned on some type of resume that they had, suggesting that even if they didn't finish or complete the curriculum because of the closure, they still felt connected to the institution, and that kind of springboarded what they would do later. So a lot of the students go to Howard University, for instance, after it closes, but they see themselves as products of both institutions. So the University of South Carolina during Reconstruction is still very much a piece of their life. And then there's always these questions of the forgotten legacy. Why is it that most students at the University of South Carolina today simply don't know about this particular moment, despite the fact that it's a rather incredible mark within the university's history? And so those are the broader questions that I'm still trying to figure out. But with that, I'll close. And thank you very much for your time and listening.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Shari, Rabin, and Adam Domby, please.
Hi, thank you to everybody who helped make this panel happen, everybody who's here watching. It's really an honor to be here. So Adam and I are introducing you today to a man named Simon Gerstmann, who we've been working on for a few years now. Gerstmann was born in the Russian Empire in 1833 and emigrated to the United States as a young man in the early 1850s. He enlisted in the US Army and fought in the Third Seminole War, finally kind of making his way to Savannah before the Civil War, where he kind of remained throughout the duration. As we discuss in our article that's going to be in the next issue of the Journal of Southern History, Gerstmann claimed to be a unionist and filed multiple claims for reimbursement from the federal government. So in the years after the Civil War, he was kind of constantly looking backward at his own activities during the Civil War in order to prove his loyalty. And yet, we're going to talk today about the ways in which he was always kind of looking forward to, desperately trying to make a life and a living. So in what follows, it's a bit of an experiment. We're going to take turns narrating Gerstmann's Reconstruction career from the perspective of different source bases. In recent years, there's been renewed interest in the religious dimensions of Reconstruction politics. And so after kind of narrating him two different ways, we're going to bring it together and end with some reflections on Gerstmann's case and how he contributes to that project. So what emerges, as you'll see, is a picture of a man who remade himself time and time again through movements, through lies, and through religion. So according to the Jewish press and the congregational records that we have, in 1868, Simon Gerstmann was a merchant who had recently resigned as both president and also acting minister of Savannah's so-called Polish Jewish congregation, B'nai B'rith Jacob, which had been founded in 1861. By August of 1870, though, he had moved on to Danville, Pennsylvania, where he entered the ministry as his primary occupation for the first time. The first ordained rabbi actually only arrived in the US in 1840, and for many decades after, most congregations were led by so-called ministers, religious leaders who were not formally ordained, but who were capable of leading services and performing other functions, ranging from delivering sermons to slaughtering animals in the ways required by kosher food laws. These positions as religious functionaries were very unstable and poorly paid, so turnover was very high, with men moving back and forth between the ministry and other pursuits, and sometimes doing both at the same time. So, for instance, the position that Gerstmann occupied in Danville had been advertised as a chasen and shochet, a service leader and a slaughterer, as well as a teacher, at a salary of about $900 per annum, with an additional requirement to lecture in both English and German. Although a correspondent to the Jewish Messenger newspaper wrote that Gerstmann had been blessed with success, he was in fact in Danville for less than a year. He went on to spend 2 years in Portsmouth, Ohio, 1 year in Meridian, Mississippi, and 6 months in Selma, Alabama, before moving on to St. Joseph, Missouri, where he would stay until 1879. This kind of instability in the Jewish ministry was widespread. Congregations were afraid of fraud. Ministers complained of capricious congregants. It was concerning to many Jewish leaders, and it was one of the main motives for a long-running project of trying to create a Jewish union and rabbinical seminary, a project that dated to the 1840s. There was no Jewish denominational body in this period. So they're trying to make one. And in 1871, Rabbi Isaac Merwise hosted a conference in Cincinnati toward this end, which ended up bearing fruit 2 years later with the founding of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. This became what is today the denominational body for Reform Judaism, which is the largest Jewish movement in the US. So Gerstmann was present at that 1871 meeting in Cincinnati, where he served on a committee on circuit preaching, offering to occasionally deliver sermons and lectures to small Jewish communities. Explicitly invoking the Methodist example, the committee hoped not only to enlighten Jews living in far-flung places, but also to stave off the threat of Christian missionary efforts and to elevate the standing of Jews in their communities. Later that summer of 1871, in between gigs, Gerstmann lectured in Springfield, Ohio. The next year, he traveled to Charleston, West Virginia. It was allegedly the first time in the history of Charleston for a Jewish rabbi to pay a visit. His audience included prominent Christians, including the governor, and he reportedly spoke with an eloquence and force hardly expected of so young an exponent of Hebrew principles. He was, in fact, 38 years old. I don't know how young that was, but that's how he was interpreted by his audience. And most of the accounts of his work as a minister were tremendously positive. When he first arrived in Portsmouth, an anonymous subscriber to the Israelite newspaper described his inaugural sermon as a masterpiece, although the next week another man objected that Mr. Gerstmann understands little of music. Music was important because the congregation had a choir and an organ, which allied them with the sort of pragmatic brand of religious reform that was spreading in this period. The goal of Reform Judaism was to elevate Judaism through various forms of modernization. So this included alterations in belief, for instance, rejecting the idea of a resurrection, a physical resurrection of the dead in the world to come. It also included alterations in practice, for instance, eliminating the second day of diasporic holiday celebrations. And in terms of worship, Reform congregations often included choirs, which were controversial when including women and or non-Jews, and also organs, which were controversial because traditional interpretations of Jewish law forbid musical instrumentation on the Sabbath. Reform congregations also held confirmation ceremonies for young men and women instead of the traditional male-only bar mitzvah. One observer of confirmation ceremonies that Gerstmann oversaw in St. Joseph wrote that he unquestionably deserves praise for the manner in which he fulfilled his duties. The services were in English and attracted a large assembly, part of whom were non-Israelites anxious to witness what was to them a novel ceremony. Gerstmann also oversaw weddings, anniversary celebrations, which actually don't really have a basis in Jewish law, and at least 2 conversions of Christian women partnered with Jewish men. His own wife was a leader in the Ladies Hebrew Benevolent Societies in Danville, Meridian, and Selma, and actively raised funds for Hebrew Union College, America's first rabbinical seminary, which was founded in 1875. And starting in Portsmouth, Gerstmann also advertised himself as a moil or a ritual circumciser, claiming to have been skillfully taught by an experienced surgeon. Later, he would regularly publish testimonials in Jewish newspapers from satisfied fathers and medical doctors alike. Gerstmann's career as a Jewish minister then was a busy one, concerned with facilitating the life cycles of Jewish men and women, but in ways that embraced American norms and standards. When the Union of American Hebrew Congregations was founded finally in 1873, Gerstmann was serving in Meridian, Mississippi, and he promised to do all that lays in my power to further this laudable object. In 1875, he began corresponding with the Union secretary, writing about his wife's fundraising, and also ordering Bibles to sell, including to some local Christian ministers. So then the picture of Gerstmann that we have from these Jewish sources, and the literal only image we have of him, which you can see here on the screen, is of a rabbi, although highly unlikely that he was actually ordained. Right? We have a picture of a relatively unremarkable religious functionary, an ally of Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise and his broader project of religious reform and institutional union.
Excellent. Now I'm going to take over and talk about Gerstmann from a different perspective. Looking at Gerstmann as a Reconstruction historian and a scholar of fraud provides a different picture, if you will. According to local newspapers, court records, and government documents, Gerstmann was already in a precarious situation by the end of 1869. Despite receiving $16,000 from the federal government just a few years earlier for his loyalty that he had proclaimed, he had massive debts and was on the brink of economic disaster. By August of 1870, he would be forced to flee Savannah, beginning sort of a decades of dizzying movement around the country. But before he fled, Gerstmann was sued in Georgia repeatedly for cheating and swindling, as well as non-payment of his debts. And so by 1870, his property in Georgia was being seized and auctioned off. And in April, Gerstmann was arrested and extradition proceedings began because he had obtained property under false pretenses from a Kentucky safe company, which he had claimed to have $50,000 worth of property in order to gain credit to then get product sent to him. So he would be arrested for this, but he would avoid extradition because of larger political fights around Reconstruction in Georgia. A judge actually rejected the legitimacy of the warrant for Gerstmann's arrest because it was signed Rufus Bullock, governor of Georgia. The judge argued that since Bullock was the provisional governor under the Reconstruction Acts, his actions were not empowered under Georgia law. The judge, Henry Wetmore, later claimed that it was the informality of the warrant that was the issue, but he argued at the time that only the commanding general of the 3rd Military District, Alfred Terry, could order the extradition. And so in the aftermath of the 1868 expulsion of black legislators and subsequent return to military rule in Georgia, many Republicans were leery of ending Reconstruction too soon. And Wetmore was actually a radical Republican who wanted to establish the supremacy of the Reconstruction Acts, making it clear that Georgia still had to answer to federal authorities. However, the finding by a Chatham County judge that Bullock was not a true governor was statewide news. On the surface and in the eyes of Democrats eager to delegitimize Reconstruction, it appeared that Bullock was a powerless figurehead with no powers. At stake beyond Gerstmann's freedom was the very legality of Reconstruction governments. The judge would be ousted from office over the case, reportedly at bayonet point, by General Terry. And of course, as you likely know, Bullock eventually flees the state as Reconstruction falters in Georgia. The decision, though, would have little impact on Gerstmann's immediate situation. On April 19th, he was released by the judge on the Kentucky extradition case, but was arrested immediately by the sheriff and charged with similar offenses against Georgia. He was released later that day, but his troubles were not over. Within days, he was arrested a 3rd time under the original charges, this time by military authorities, and the case given to the United States District Court. The local newspaper, Savannah Morning News, reported that he was able to settle the case with a payment of $1,700, but this was money he desperately needed to pay other debts. At this point, Gerstmann owed over $7,000 to various merchants and lenders who were already suing him or would sue him in the coming months. Now, while most of these debts were run up in 1869 or 70, some of these debts actually dated back to the Civil War, and Gerstmann argued in court for favorable conversion rates from Confederate to U.S. dollars. On top of all this, in April of 1870, he was indicted in the U.S. District Court for violating revenue laws as part of a case that had begun earlier that year. It appears to have had something to do with alcohol sales, but the details remain to be studied by Shari and I. We still need to sort of figure that one out. The next month, his brother-in-law sued him, and the court ordered Gerstmann's building sold off. His family may have actually been suing him in an attempt to protect some wealth that was being seized anyways, due to all of Gerstmann's debts, but we're not really sure. We do know that, desperate for money, Simon may have actually tried passing off fraudulent bills as well. In a local paper, a neighbor warned Savannah residents not to accept any promissory notes with his name on it if Gerstmann offered them. Gerstmann had similarly co-signed a bond for Savannah's collector of revenue, who absconded later that year. So they're sort of piling up these issues. Clearly, 1870 was not a great year for Gerstmann to be in Savannah. So leaving Georgia via Florida, by August, he was in Pennsylvania, where he became a rabbi, self-proclaimed. In the years to come, Gerstmann repeatedly sought to ingratiate himself with various political leaders as well, including Ulysses S. Grant, Winfield Scott Hancock, and Zebulon Vance. Now, how many leaders actually knew Gerstmann remains unknown. A letter from a senator doesn't necessarily imply a close relationship, but he did reportedly receive telegrams on his 25th wedding anniversary from both Vance and Hancock. We don't know if these were courtesies done because they were requested or sincere message from friends, but Gerstmann certainly presented them as friends and sought to be perceived as influential by his neighbors. From the perspectives of these sources, and in stark contrast to Jewish sources, Gerstmann appears to be an economic failure and a fraud who was seeking to influence the political affairs of Reconstruction. With only Jewish sources, then, Gerstmann looks like a pious reformer, earnestly laboring on behalf of Judaism. Without Jewish sources, Gerstmann appears a con man, insincere in nearly everything he did. In our own conversations, Shari and I have replicated this impulse. I often point to lies, and Shari tries to soften my interpretation by bringing up other activities and extenuating circumstances. We've learned a lot from each other through, because the truth is that both narratives are correct. Gerstmann lied a lot, and he also assiduously engaged in religious life and advocated for Jews across the country. So different sources reveal different Gerstmanns, but there are hints of each in each other. Looking at them together, Gerstmann highlights geographic mobility and his continued efforts to remake himself. It is notable, for instance, that as president for Savannah Synagogue, Gerstmann's main legacy was mismanaging the construction of a new building, putting the congregation into debt. The synagogue was nearly sold off for failing to pay its lease, and a friend and creditor had to save the house of worship from being sold off by purchasing it. But Gerstmann's own legal troubles continued to grow, and allies in Georgia were less forthcoming. Few men are able to get arrested 3 times in less than 10 days. Fewer still go on to successful careers as religious leaders. But in fact, the volatile economic and political life of Reconstruction era Georgia that sent Gerstmann northward and into religious leadership, and his precarious economic situation continued to shape his actions after as well. So they're related. At the 1871 meeting in Cincinnati, Gerstmann proposed a mutual life and benefit insurance society for ministers. In his lecture in West Virginia, it was grandiose, but it seems clearly close to home, as it was entitled The True Philosophy of Life and the Inequality of Human Fortune. Later on, the Union of American Hebrew Congregation's secretary was frustrated that Gerstmann sent payments only after receiving Bible shipments. And he complained later on that Gerstmann had sent a bad check. Now, Gerstmann was not only a minister and a reformer then, but he was a man engaged in shady business dealings and at times outright fraud. These are unsavory actions that American Jews would probably rather ignore or narrate as beyond the pale of Jewish history, and that anti-Semites might engage to use to smear Jews in general. Understanding this context, though, highlights the ministry not only as a pure and sincere calling, but as an economic strategy in a time of tremendous upheaval. By 1875, Gerstmann was living in St. Joseph, Missouri. And that year he told a newspaper editor that he was trying to bring his friend, Zebulon Vance, to St. Joseph, Missouri to give his popular lecture, The Scattered Nation. In this speech, Vance, of course better known for his role as governor and senator from North Carolina, described Jews in laudatory terms, but also in racialized language. He said Jews were our spiritual fathers who were somehow freed from malarious disease and in possession of peculiarities of form. Gerstmann had his own canned lecture that he gave in the late 1870s, frequently entitled The Wandering Jew. So Vance may have actually been a role model as much as an ally. The religious and political again overlapped in 1876, when Gerstmann appeared at the sentencing of 2 Jewish men convicted for their participation in the whiskey ring. Religion even shaped his appeal. Invoking the men's wives and children, he told the judge, I plead as did Moses of old, standing before Pharaoh the tyrant, pleading for the innocent. The Jewish messenger noted he had made this address in court before the sentence was even pronounced, rather an unusual thing for a rabbi. A few months later, he traveled to Washington to lobby for these pardons again, and this time attended at the same time the 3rd Annual Council of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, where he offered a resolution asking for the entire body to pay their respects to the President of the United States. Reporting back home, reports were that Gerstmann was on quite intimate terms with Grant, but they're not verifiable at this point, although the 3 men Gerstmann sought to get their sentence commuted did in fact get Latin sentences. So an erstwhile Southerner living in Missouri by way of the Midwest, Gerstmann actually appears something of a reconciliationist, fostering ties to Jews across the country, but also to the Democrat Vance and the Republican Grant. And he later supported Winfield Scott Hancock, who he claimed to know from his army days. Gerstmann shows that although Jews were a tiny minority, their religious institutions and networks actively contributed to the political movements of the Reconstruction era. These were not just cynical ploys for power. At the time, Bible wars in public urban schools and a campaign to add a constitutional amendment declaring the U.S. a Christian nation These were also bids for American Jewish citizenship, and I'll let Shari finish us off.
So we don't have time to get into it, but in the 1880s, let's just say that Gerstmann's sort of chaotic energy and remarkable ability to remake himself continued. And he's only one man, right? But his misadventures, we think, really help us to see the slippery lines between the supposedly sacred and the supposedly secular in the Reconstruction era, and also the range of actors working to shape the future of the South and the nation. To write about Gerstmann takes the expertise that we have in both Southern history and in Jewish history, and it's helped us to see that they often can be understood to be the same. In the late 1860s and 1870s, Jewish life was directly shaped by Reconstruction, which, while a story of race, party, and region, also should be understood as a story of people of diverse backgrounds reconstructing themselves, leaving behind their pasts and creating new futures through lies, through religion, and sometimes through both. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And now we have Bruce Baker up, please.
Thanks, Allie. This paper is part of a longer project that I've been engaged in over the past 5 years or so to try to get a better ground level understanding of the New Orleans waterfront in the 2 decades after the Civil War, the cotton trade in that city, and the interconnections between labor and subsistence strategies within an economic system where legitimate trade, an underground economy, crime, and fraud became categories that not only bled over into one another, but actually mutually constituted one another. I've published pieces about the trade in loose cotton, the market for stolen goods, and some of the elaborate scams involving tugboat cartels and salvage fraud that shaped shipping in New Orleans in this period. This particular piece came about when I ran into 2 interesting cases and came to realize they had certain parallels and even connections. Elephant Johnny was a memorable character who I found when trying to understand the kinds of places where people sold loose cotton that they had stolen. He was also the subject of a long newspaper profile in the New Orleans Times in 1873 in a series entitled Humanity in Our City. I became quite interested in the role of barrel houses and coffee houses as hubs for the informal economy, but in Elephant Johnny's case, it became clear that he was also an important figure in African-American working-class Republican politics in the Third Ward, and also got involved in labor disputes. As for the Crimps, a 19th century term for businessmen who provided lodging to sailors and acted as labor agents for shipmasters, a different article in the same 1873 series detailed their operations, but there was also a hint that they got involved in politics, except on the Democratic side. As a result, my focus here is to explore these 2 different systems for the organization and control of key parts of the waterfront labor force and how those systems interacted with local politics at the ward and parish level. It is, as shall become obvious, very exploratory and unfinished, which I said when I gave a version of this 2 years ago, and its conditions have meant it's less developed than it was. I had hoped it would be by this time. Anyway, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, there were around 7 or 8 boarding houses that were identified as catering primarily to sailors. I've been able to identify locations for 6 of them. They seem to have been primarily concentrated along the waterfront near the point where Esplanade and Elysian Fields converge at the river, and thus falling in the 6th Ward and also the 8th Ward. The 2 boarding houses in the 6th Ward sat right alongside Gallatin Street, long, quote, the center of a vicious underworld district, end quote, according to Herbert Asbury's classic 1936 account of the French Quarter. The proprietors were a mixed lot, and sources suggest several had a propensity for violence, though to be fair, this did not necessarily distinguish them from many others around the New Orleans waterfront. Thomas Buckley appears to have arrived in New Orleans around 1871, and by the next year was running a saloon, apparently attached to a boarding house, at 337 Decatur Street, alongside the waterfront. Oliver Canton differed from the other Crimps in that by the early 1870s, his boarding house catered exclusively to black sailors making the trip back and forth from Liverpool. Ship crews were apparently segregated, all white or all black, at least according to some sources I've seen. Kenton was originally from County Mayo in Ireland and immigrated to Quebec around 1840. There he married a widow with 3 sons, including John Brewster. We'll hear more about Brewster later. And by 1850, the family was in New Orleans running a boarding house and saloon on the corner of Gallatin and Hospital Streets. Historian Judith Vingard notes that there was considerable movement of crimps between Canadian ports and New Orleans due to seasonal shipping patterns and changing legislation. At some point, Kenton's stepson, John Brewster, opened his own boarding house for white sailors, though relations between the two seem to have been strained, judging from newspaper accounts of them attacking each other. The crimping system was a genius 19th century invention for the extraction of maximum profit from a readily available resource, in this case, the transient population of sailors moving through the port. When a ship arrived, the sailors disembarking were met by runners. Sometimes the runners came out to the ship in skiffs before it even docked. The runners told the sailors of the pleasures that awaited, a welcome contrast to the privation and discipline on shipboard. And what pleasures they were: beef, pork, ham, and the sailors may eat when they please and eat what they please. The wonderful thing for the sailor was that no cash was required for these transactions. Instead, the sailor ran a tab that would be settled by the advance he received against his wages when he shipped out on a new vessel. In practice, this meant that the crimp provided room and board up to the point where the advance matched the tab, and then it was time for the sailor to leave and settle up. An abstemious sailor who preferred rest to debauchery might stretch this period out to a couple weeks. Men of a more vigorous disposition may find they burn through their credit with dismaying haste, as little as 5 days. And the finances worked out very well for the crimps. Room and board was charged at $6 a day, about half of which was pure profit, and that was before considering the earnings from the in-house bar. Sailors leaving New Orleans, headed for Liverpool, could expect $50 to $55 in advance, plus $30 per month. Since journeys going in the opposite direction paid as little as $15 in advance and $15 a month, sailors had a very powerful incentive to break their contracts once they were in New Orleans and sign with a new ship after a few days of rest and relaxation. Crimps were only too happy to help, but they were hard-nosed about it. When a ship needed hands, the crimps rounded them up without so much as a by your leave, a process made easier by the liberal pouring of whiskey at the bar. Rumors said that at least one sailor, delivered in a wheelbarrow over the side of the ship like a sack of corn, was not just dead drunk, but actually dead. The passage of the 1872 Shipping Commissioners Act had some significant effects on the crimping system across the United States, including New Orleans. The crimping system described earlier had long been the target of reformers' ire, and the conditions sailors served under had been critiqued since Richard Henry Dana Jr.'s 2 years before the mast in 1840. In the 1860s, English campaigner Samuel Plimsoll worked to secure legislation to make ships safer. In this context, and with a Republican government that, as historians such as Heather Cox Richardson and Richard Bensel have shown, was willing to expand its capacities and its engagement with how business was run and how free laborers should fit into the economy, it is not surprising that legislation to control how sailors were engaged was passed. The creation of U.S. shipping commissioners also took some of the burden off of regular U.S. commissioners who had plenty to do already, especially in places like New Orleans. The law, as passed in June 1872, gave the U.S. shipping commissioners, appointed by the Federal Circuit Court, the exclusive responsibility, quote, to superintend their sailors' engagement and discharge, and, quote, to provide means for securing the presence on board at the proper times of men who are so engaged, end quote. Moreover, it strove to drive crimps out of business by stipulating that anyone accepting money from a sailor seeking employment could be fined $100, that any wages advanced to a seaman could be paid only to him or his wife, and that wages advanced to anyone else could be legally recovered by the seaman from whoever paid them as if they had never been paid. At a stroke, the Crimps business model lay in tatters, and by the following year, this legislation was explicitly recognized as sparking a, quote, war between the United States Shipping Commissioner of the Port of New York and the Landlords Association, the Crimps Group, in New York, though it's likely that the intensity of such a war depended on the enthusiasm of the local commissioner. It seems safe to say that Captain William Wright, appointed as the shipping commissioner for New Orleans, could be described as a no-nonsense sort of man. Born in Dublin, he had served in the British Army before immigrating to Connecticut and working in the Colt Arms Factory. He raised a company for the 9th Connecticut and first saw New Orleans when he was involved in capturing it. Marrying locally, he settled in and became active in Republican Party politics. When he was named to the post in November 1872, one of his first actions was to announce that, quote, all seamen will be mustered in on board in the daytime only, end quote. Elephant Johnny, whose name was John Cowan, sits in a different location from the Crimps, both physically in the waterfront's geography, but also demographically and politically. And while Elephant Johnny may have been somewhat atypical in the way he combined a number of roles, he probably was not unique in acting as a grassroots broker of social, economic, and political connections and support for a working-class constituency. His career in New Orleans, as far as I can tell, appears to have been relatively brief. I'm only certain that he was in the city by 1873, and I have no solid evidence past the middle of 1875. A lot of chasing through the census and trying to find a lot of people named John Cowan, but he might have moved to Cincinnati afterwards. What seems reasonably clear is that Cowan purchased or perhaps only rented the premises at number 55 and 57 Delta Street, which is very near the casino now, between Lafayette and Poydras, when it became available in summer 1873. One of the buildings had a hall that was large enough for meetings. A variety of services were available, as an 1874 article explains. Quote, the cheapest lodging house in town, where one can get a roosting place and a drink for 5 cents, or in the absence of 5 cents, an old shoe or an antiquated hat, end quote. While I have no direct evidence yet, I'm confident that Elephant Johnny's place also served as a location where waterfront workers could meet to find out about work opportunities. It was only 2 or 3 squares off of the waterfront. Certainly, outside observers believed it also served as a center for criminal activity, particularly the fencing of stolen goods. Elephant Johnny also served an important role as a supporter and organizer of waterfront labor. Early in 1874, probably in response to the Panic of 1873, longshoremen were thrown out of work because ships were forcing sailors to do their work at no additional wages for the sailors. A mass meeting in February condemned the practice, and in March 1874, the Longshoremen's Protective Union and Benevolent Association was incorporated, with a mix of white and black officers. At a rally of roustabouts in early May, roustabouts being the guys who worked on the steamboats coming down the river, and longshoremen being the guys who worked on the ocean-going vessels. The roustabouts in May 1874 complained of being forced to work for as little as 45 cents a day and insisted on $3 a day for a day no longer than 10 hours, a move which the slightly more cautious longshoremen organizations distanced themselves from. Elephant Johnny, one of the main speakers at the roustabouts rally, promised, quote, the men, if they struck, he would support any number of them for 15 days, end quote. Where all this interfaces with politics is complex and easier to see in the case of Elephant Johnny than with the Crimps. At the beginning of March 1874, Cowan took the lead in organizing a new radical Republican club in the 3rd Ward in preparation for that year's political campaign. Over 200 members turned up for the first meeting, a number that's quite significant because it represents almost a quarter of the number of Republican votes cast in the ward, and this is where conservatives outvoted Republicans by 2-to-1 margin. The club met regularly in the meeting room attached to Elephant Johnny's barrel house over the next few months. On Election Day, Elephant Johnny's place was one of the polling locations. But the Elephant Club, as it was called, was also part of the paramilitary politics that played such an important role in Reconstruction, and in no time and place more so than New Orleans in 1874. The White League had formed to take control of the state by one means or another, culminating in the Battle of Liberty Place on September 14th, 1874, when 5,000 well-organized White League troops overwhelmed the state militia and metropolitan police and seized control for 3 days before being displaced by federal force. This successful use of force, as it did elsewhere, such as in South Carolina 2 years later, led some African Americans to weigh up their prospects and begin to shift to the conservatives. In October, in advance of the pending elections, White League leaders such as George W. Dupree began organizing conservative clubs of African Americans to counter the growing influence of their equivalent radical clubs. One was set up just a few doors down from Elephant Johnny's Barrel House, and there was mutual intimidation and minor scuffling over the next few weeks. The broad point I'm trying to make here is that in order to understand the role of someone such as Elephant Johnny, we must keep in view his role as a barrel house keeper, a political leader at the ward level, and a supporter of organized labor, not to mention his connections with the Waterfront's underground economy. On the side of the Crimps, the political dynamic is less clear but equally intriguing. In 1866, a state legislator from New Orleans made an extraordinary claim, and of course it's significant that what I'm going to say here is about how the Crimps operated politically well before black enfranchisement. So this legislator says in 1866, quote, "It had been a practice with sailor boarding house keepers to register their boarders, and after those boarders left, keeping the certificates of registry to procure other persons to vote under the certificates. Extensive frauds were practiced in this way," end quote. While I don't have time today to go into much detail, this practice seems to have only accelerated during the contentious politics of Reconstruction. From 1872 through 1876, there were escalating contests between Republicans and Democrats, especially in the 3rd Ward and the 6th Ward, to see who could either register more of their own voters who didn't actually exist, or else prevent bona fide voters for the other party from voting. And the creative management of voting certificates was an important part of this. And here I'd just sort of say that we talk a lot about street level fighting and so forth, and that's definitely important. But I think this wrangling over voter certificates is certainly important and probably more important than we've paid a lot of close attention to. And it's possible that this ability to control a large number of voters, or at least voting certificates, which is the main thing, laid the groundwork for the political careers of some sailor house boarding keepers. Thomas Buckley was one of the 6th Ward's delegates to the Parish Conservative Convention in October of 1872. He remained in this role in 1874 as well. Much more prominent, however, was the career of John Brewster, the stepson of Oliver Canton. An 1872 paramilitary group of conservatives in the 6th Ward named themselves in his honor, and he served as a delegate to the Parish Conservative Convention that year. When someone was arrested for altering ballots in the election in November 1872, Brewster posted $500 bond for him. In December 1872, a Republican complaining about the 6th Ward swore, quote, "that the house on Front Levee, known as Brewster's boarding house," end quote, could house no more than 80 men, but that 200 votes were cast by men registered at that address. The same thing happened with Devan's house on Old Levee Street, who's another sailor boarding house keeper, and another house on the corner of Barracks and Gallatin Streets. Brewster's work expanded in 1874, serving as a 6th Ward delegate again, and also serving on the Parish Democratic Committee's election committee. Brewster continued to be an active, if not major figure in New Orleans Democratic politics for the rest of his life, serving for many years as tax collector of the 2nd District. The ability to control the allocation of sailors' labor, and perhaps their votes, provided a base for political power and highlights the complex links between labor on the New Orleans waterfront and the politics of the city and ultimately the state. So, where does this leave us? In the time remaining, I'd like to sketch out the ideas I have of how I think I'll continue to flesh out this research and some of the reasons I think it might be worthwhile. I'll start with the reasons for trying to do more with this. Despite the excellent work the better part of a generation ago by Eric Arneson and more recent scholarship by historians such as Justin Nystrom, James Illingworth, Scott Marler, John Bardis, I don't believe we have the kind of detailed understanding of the economy and business practices of the New Orleans waterfront that we need. In the work I've been doing in the past 2 or 3, 4 years, I'm arguing that it's impossible to untangle what we might consider the white economy, the gray economy, and the black economy. Drawing on an insight from Peter Linebaugh in The London Hanged, I believe that crime and fraud not only tinkered around the margins of the formal economy, but actually helped structure it every bit as much as the decisions taken by proper businessmen, a considerable number of whom at all levels were involved in some shady practices anyway, And to really get at this, we cannot just start with the formal institutions such as the New Orleans Cotton Exchange and the larger trade union organizations and work our way down. We need to start on the docks with the work that was done, the gritty details of it and who was doing it, and build our accounts up from there. Only then will we be able to see how work practices, crime, corruption, and violence fit into the political structures at ward level that then pass power up to the higher levels of politics. So, how to do this? There's still many untapped resources. Most of what I've done so far relies on careful trawling through newspapers, and there's scope for more of that. But congressional reports about the 1874 election and other investigations probably contain valuable material as well. The records of the U.S. Commissioners and U.S. District Court in Fort Worth probably have some cases where sailors were in disputes with Crimps that would provide a lot more details. And also police and local court records in the New Orleans Public Library would be useful. And there's a lot to do once I can actually, get to libraries, archives, New Orleans, that sort of thing out of this room. So I'll just sort of wrap it up there, except to say just generally, and I might say more about this if I have a chance later, that I think there's a role to look at the role of admiralty jurisdiction in Reconstruction that sort of opens up things that we haven't looked at quite enough. So I'll just leave it there somewhat cryptically.
Okay, thank you so much. And now our comments from Dr. Frantz and Dr. Horne.
There we go. Okay, excellent. So really fascinating papers, and everything in them is sort of unexpected in a welcome way. And I think that's kind of like the theme, that new characters. And I love this idea of particularly looking at the Reconstruction era, not just looking at marginalized people as historians like to do, right? But not just those who are marginalized along the lines of race, gender, class, though many of your figures are, but people who are just like weirdos and outcasts, people who are just, they don't fit into any sort of box that we have. And as I was reading these things, I was thinking the Reconstruction period in a lot of ways is the best way to find people like this. It's sort of like, the era of, of the weirdo, it's, and I was thinking about this because I've been also reading this week for class. I was rereading James Scott's Weapons of the Weak, great classic. And he was talking about, he just kind of, said, what actually changes transcripts, these fundamental transcripts, they're pretty solid, right? But what actually shifts them? And he's like, not so much revolution. What really shifts them is economic change, is kind of stark economic change. And so as I was reading this papers, I'm like, the Reconstruction era has always seemed to me like a time when anything, the new people are talking about now is kind of like the new, the second revolution, but really a time of incredible creativity and openness. But incredible creativity and openness because there weren't any rules. The rules were messed up, right? And so that even, and Bruce was kind of talking about this, black and white, the black economy, the white economy, and the gray economy, and kind of talking about how they're all connected. And I was like, maybe it's even more than that. Maybe there is no white economy. Like maybe like during this time, maybe there's actually no set of rules that it would be possible for anyone to actually follow, right? And so, and I mean that culturally, I mean that economically, that maybe what's happened is there's such an unsettled economy, and such a sort of unsettled set of social norms everywhere, right? That it actually sort of becomes impossible, just like with farmers during this period complained that they were sort of forced to become speculators because their land values were so unstable. And I feel like maybe that was true of just people in the world, that they were sort of forced to become, everybody was sort of forced to become a con man, simply because the ground on which they were standing was sort of constantly shifting. So anyway, this was the overview of all of these papers. All of these papers made me think about that. But I want to talk, I thought about, the Reconstruction era as a Wild West, spread across the nation with all the violence that implies. A land of opportunity, but then, of course, most of the opportunity is going to be thwarted by the very fact that the ground continues to shift, even as you grab what you can. So the land of fleeting and dangerous opportunity, where violence is always in uncomfortable proximity, to opportunity. So first I wanted to think about Bruce's paper. And I kept on thinking, as you were talking about crimping, it took me like this long, but like, sometime like 3 times reading through it, I thought, man, crimps are pimps, for workers, right? Exactly. And I don't know why it took me that long, but, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm like, first of all, I'm just wondering linguistically about the term, but second, I'm just like, whoa, could you tie this into some sort of like, literature on the exploitation and sort of, management of sexual labor? Maybe it's some of the same people even, right, who are doing some of these, because really what pimps are doing, and this is what I just read Kate Mazur's new book, and and she had this lovely discussion of the exploitation and the kind of frequent harassment by the police of Black sailors in New Orleans, right? And so I was wondering if this crimping system first sort of might have emerged as a way to protect from the police these Black sailors, particularly if there was crimping of Black sailors, that could have worked exactly the same way as pimping, right? But anyway, that was just a thought. But generally speaking, I just wonder if, because of the sort of chaos of this period, that maybe we could think of this as a period when sort of political virtue is impossible, for the Elephant Johnnies of the world, right? And I also just love, the continuity that you're drawing between the criminal world and the political world. And I think we have to double down on that and triple down on that until we understand that, the criminal world, that first of all crime is political, another James Scottism, but secondly, that all politics, I don't know if I want to go that far, right? But the politics itself, is often connected to, criminal behavior, or sort of, the contested line between the illegal and the legal and the illegal. But I love this. Okay. I also wanted to say about Shari and Adam's fascinating paper. Oh, can people hear me? Okay, I just got a weird symbol on my computer. Shari and Adam's paper, I was thinking about, the fascinating Simon Gerstmann, and, thinking about him as, a person, a self-creator, and thinking about just the rich soil of the Reconstruction era, where you can recreate yourself, and why not do it multiple times, right? Why not do it in many, many different ways at once, right? This kind of exciting opportunity of self-creation. And I was thinking that particularly if you were a person who could speak well, I mean, if the problem of the Reconstruction era is that the transcript has been disrupted, the transcript is no longer functional, right, of a previous time, and everybody's kind of building a new set of norms together. If you're a fluid speaker, like we know that he was, you have incredible opportunity during this time. And so I was thinking about that. And somehow Microsoft Teams is launching right now, so I hope you can continue with me here. Yeah, so that's basically what I wanted to say about him. I am really curious why he was selling Bibles, and I was wondering if somebody could enlighten me on that, because I found that a little bit like just off to the side interesting. And then thirdly, just to mention about Tyler's also fascinating paper. You know, it really brings out both, you know, in the same way, the potential of this period, the radicalism of this period, you know, and also the tragedy of this period, you know, that there's this real opportunity that the sort of the Henry Haynes, you know, William Henry Hurds, O.L.W. Smiths, Calerso, Minnie Thompson Allens, and Celia Dial Saxons, you know, really could use this period to make their permanent move in the upper class. And I kept on thinking as I was reading about people like, about Allison Parker's new book, you know, about Mary Church Terrell, you know, and how many people really did use this, people of color really did use this period, you know, were able to kind of take advantage of this moment of excitement and sort of creative possibility to recreate themselves and establish themselves and their sort of families in the future. But I love also just the idea of this place that you know, this sort of almost utopian university, right? You know, where they're doing all sorts of things. You know, they're providing free tuition. I mean, they're doing things that they're doing, you know, preparatory courses, you know, for disadvantaged students and things like that, which just seems crazy before their time. You know, many of these things, and what I just really loved is, you know, what you call the general atmosphere of the integrated university, this sort of moment when, at least in this small place, we can create this new possible world, you know, this, and I just thought that was just such a powerful, you know, expression of sort of what Reconstruction, you know, was or could have been. The one thing I wondered about this, and this is just really small, but I wonder, I got the percentages of, you know, the race of the students there. I never really got the total number of students who came through here. And I'm actually really curious about how many students were able to have this opportunity. And then I also loved how you quoted Henry Fox as talking about what he called the incoherent racism of the day. And you use the word incoherent, and you're not quoting him. But I wonder if he actually used the word incoherent himself or described it as specifically incoherent, right? Because to me, that's the whole, you know, again, the James Scott transcript, you know, the norms have become incoherent. And so I kind of wonder if he was actually calling out that incoherence, you know, in the kind of ideas of the racists. And then finally, I wanted to say of all these papers, to some extent, the papers themselves, I think, struggled a little bit with not wanting to fit into traditional narrative structures, right? And I think that, you know, that both, you know, Adam and Shari's paper and Bruce's paper, you know, you kind of said, this is a tough one to write. Like, we can't quite get it right as far as like the format of this, right? And I really feel that it's because the period itself is incoherent. You know, it's like fundamental incoherence is the thing about the Reconstruction era, right? And that we're trying to impose this sort of, you know, these sort of later models that we've developed of sort of like the difference between the political and the criminal, and, you know, all of these things, and that maybe these models really, you know, really weren't as meaningful during this period. So maybe, not that we have to be incoherent, but maybe we should give ourselves a bit of a break, because inherence is sort of like pulling at us, I think, from the Reconstruction era. So thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I just want to thank all the panelists for being here, and wherever here is, and two, having me here, you know, again, sort of wherever that is. I also want to sort of preemptively apologize. I have a sick 2-year-old at home who is napping, and I hear stirring, so I may sort of like vanish in a moment, you know, abruptly, and I apologize in advance for that if that's the case. But one of the things that I really enjoyed, both by the papers and then also by Elaine's comments, is this idea that we have a reconstruction that we often think of as a radical reconstruction. You know, that sort of is the term that we're seeing play out here. And I think our papers show, in fact, that we have like something more of a raucous reconstruction. It's sort of a total upending of worlds, geographies, of spaces, categories. And I think that that's very exciting. And so I, you know, thoroughly enjoyed reading everyone's papers and thinking about the ways that they informed one another. I think they're all, you know, quite brilliant and groundbreaking, each in their own ways. And I agree completely with Elaine that the narrative structure is raucous in the same ways that our historical actors are raucous. And I think that's wonderful, to be honest, and something that I enjoyed. So I want to thank you for those papers. I also want to think through this idea along the lines of raucousness that we have in Reconstruction, maybe in politics more broadly, a dynamic in which lies and fraud may be at once vehicles of liberation, a means of grasping at equality on the one hand, and then of course, especially in Tyler's paper, quite the opposite, right? Lies and fraud become sort of the means of reactionary violence. And I think we see strains of that in Bruce's paper as well. And so I want to take a look at each, presentation individually for a moment, and then sort of, again, toss the conversation back towards the group. So I have a Teams issue too, Elaine. It's all of us. It's terrible. Microsoft Teams. All right. So I'm going to start with Baker's essay. And I just want to say again, not to steal Allie's joke, I wrote this earlier, Allie, but this is an amazing band name, Elephant Johnny and the Crimps. It's beautiful. And I think it shows the complex systems of networking and plunder that working people navigate. Sometimes that they harness themselves, but the things that define the dock front, and especially as we think about the economy of New Orleans and the economy, if you sort of look at like legislative receipts, like the economy of Louisiana is very much along New Orleans's dock front. And so these are really important systems, even as they seem sort of arbitrary and at times incoherent in their plunder, in their frauds, in the lies that work through them. And although Baker builds on relatively recent work like Arneson's 1991 Dockfront Workers, maybe not as recent, but Seth Rockman's certainly much more recent Scraping By, his analysis of the interplay between race and class is reminiscent for me, and I would be interested to hear from others, of Roger Shugg's classic Origins of Class Struggle in Louisiana. There's very much a class analysis at work here that I think, in some ways is reflective of an older strain of analysis, but I think feels very new, very exciting, and carries a lot of potential. And so I will be interested to see that develop. I'm also very excited to get back into the archives in New Orleans, so I'll be keeping my fingers crossed for you, Bruce. So race and class are no mere phantoms in Baker's New Orleans, but they give rise to very real solidarities and militancies that white elites really cover up in their deconstructing of this raucous Reconstruction, and they're painting it as radical. Further, Baker's work illustrates new horizons in the field. I think, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this, Bruce, that much of this work on these sort of marginal and liminal figures is made possible by the advent of digital collections, by OCR. And I think that as we see those technologies advance, we may have at once sort of more raucous history, but also one that's more filled in, that tells a clearer narrative, because we'll have access to more sources. And so that is certainly my hope. And I would be interested to see how this story develops as you're able to access more of those sources. And the last question I have, or sort of parting thought, perhaps, is how Elephant Johnny and the Crimps complicate our understanding of the relationship between race, class, and power in Reconstruction New Orleans, in Reconstruction Louisiana, and in Reconstruction more broadly. I think we have here a messier story than the sort of quote-unquote radical Reconstruction that we are often left with after the erasures of the period. And I think in many ways, Baker's analysis here is quite groundbreaking. I want to turn briefly to Parry's work. Parry's Motley Crowd of Youngsters, another great band name. This is just, we're on a roll here, right? Like, this is excellent. And it shows the fruits of the school desegregation movement in 1870s South Carolina. And of course, we have one of those as well in Louisiana too. And so I think that, sort of piecing these together, there's a sort of a larger like desegregation story that is very interesting, especially as we think through the relationship between education and democracy. I think it's no accident that Black Americans gain writ large the right to vote at the very moment that we have these early integration efforts, and that these integration efforts are overturned at the very moment that Black enfranchisement is overturned. So where Parry finds potential solidarities in shared struggle, Parry documents these racist betrayals by white elites that undermine the possibilities of this multiracial constitutional convention that creates the possibility for this integrationist work to begin. And so we have here a potentially egalitarian struggle that, instead of being facilitated by lies and trickery, is undone by that raucous effort. Parry's work builds upon a growing body of scholarship on race, class, and education during the Civil War era, like Molly Mitchell's Raising Freedom's Child and Eric Platt's more recent Educating the Sons of Sugar. And what makes Parry's work especially interesting is his documentation of the upward mobility of formerly enslaved people through access to higher education and elite white paranoia about the meaning of that mobility. Wealthy white South Carolinians waged an all too familiar sabotage campaign, arguing that so-called white capital should only fund white schools. They did this not because they believed in Black inferiority, but in fact, as Parry shows, quite the opposite, because they observed Black social mobility. And as America's universities continue to reckon with their investment in slavery and racial apartheid, Parry's scholarship shows us just how much work remains to be done, not only in our communities and classrooms, but even with our basic understanding of the racist intellectual landscapes that we inherit. And so I guess my parting question for Parry is simply, as we think through and document the reconstruction of a regime of racial apartheid in American educational institutions, and lengthen the span of and the scope of that, our understanding of that system of racial apartheid. I wonder what in your work, both as a scholar, but also as a citizen and as a thinker, you think perhaps these universities can do to help make right the wrongs that they have very much contributed to, facilitated, enabled, and created. Those are the landscape, the world that we inherit. And so I will look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. And finally, Domby and Rabin, whose rabbi or con man should definitely not be the name of a rock supergroup, illustrate that inquiries on the relationship between religion and politics, like Edward Bloom's 2005 Reforging the White Republic, can reveal religious motives that often elude American historians, and we get a richer and more nuanced understanding of what Reconstruction entails by looking at these religious practices and motivations. Where Domby and Rabin are especially important is in identifying the impact of Jewish and migrant experiences in the execution of Reconstruction. In many respects, Gerstmann's career, even in the US, is defined by the perpetual remaking of the refugee experience. Adding characters like Gerstmann, and it appears that he was quite the character to our Reconstruction narratives, shows the rich possibility of this period of upheaval when so much seems so up in the air. I've encountered Jewish actors, Reconstruction era actors in my own research. And so one of the questions, mine is more bound geographically. Gerstmann seems to be sort of everywhere. And I think one of the opportunities that he presents us is the opportunity to think through the sort of geographical inflections of the relationship between whiteness and Jewishness during the Reconstruction era. And so my question for you is, does Gerstmann appear to be white or non-white, in group or out group in various locations, based on the geography, based on the racial demographics of those regions, or does he appear to be, is there sort of a more, I guess, sort of national, religious, ethnic othering that he experiences? So again, I want to thank all of our presenters for these wonderful papers, for the opportunity to be here, and I will turn it back over to the rest for questions.
All right, so we are actually getting really close to time, and by really close, I mean like a minute. Do we have, this is all good. Do we have any final thoughts or responses that anybody would like to chime in?
So, Will, you provided a great question at the end, which maybe you and I can talk about a little later, but I think forms of reparative justice are the way forward. Now, I think that comes from education, and so part of the motivation for the volume that's forthcoming with University of South Carolina Press is to show that history to students in order to spur future activism that truly repairs, or at least attempts to repair the past. So that's the best I can do in a short time, but I'd love to speak to you about it more.
If I could just say something very briefly, to pick up on what Elaine said, I really liked her point that perhaps the Reconstruction era is really incoherent and raucous, as Will was saying, and that when we try to write about it in our typical sort of forms, we try to impose retrospectively an order that doesn't really do justice to it. So perhaps we need to think about new ways of writing about it that will just break out of that and perhaps present a different version of this.
And I'll just say to that last question from Will that I think like the incoherence of the era is maybe echoed a little bit in the sort of incoherence of the Jew in some ways. Like there is so much slipperiness, and there is, he gets a lot of Gerstmann and Jews in general get a lot of sort of respect and have a lot of privileges in this period, but also, there's ways in which they remain sort of foreign in different ways, in which their differences, their economic differences, especially as merchants, make them sort of targets for some of the violence in this era. So there's an incoherence there that I think in this period of incoherence sort of doubles up in various ways.
And I guess I'll just throw in on that. One of the things that we talk about in our article that's coming out like this month is the way that he actually spends a lot of time trying to make sure Jews are accepted as Americans. And he does that most notably in the 1890s, for instance, when someone accuses Jews of not serving in the army, he sort of publicly proclaims, look, I was in the army and Jews do serve. And so he's out there sort of trying to make sure Jews are accepted into society and accepted as Americans frequently as part of his sort of his mission, if you will. That makes sense.
All right, we are a couple minutes over, but I think that was really, really wonderful. Thank everybody so much for your time and hard work. That's lots to think about from here. So thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
It's good to see you all.